Bro, imagine your own father suddenly telling you you're getting engaged to the most feared red dragon in the entire empire. Sounds like a dream come true, right? The kind of thing other people would kill for. But for our guy here, it was worse than getting thrown out of the family. Accepting the engagement meant gambling away his entire future. Refusing meant losing the one thing he'd wanted since he was a kid, to be seen as part of his own family. And that's exactly where everything fell apart. Ferda's father decided to arrange his marriage to Archduke Valdrova, and that's where everything started. His father told him flatly that he must already understand what this decision meant. For Ferda, the engagement felt like a nightmare. He would never have reacted this way if circumstances hadn't forced his hand. For a noble, a decision like this was final. He had only two choices: refuse and get cast out of the family, or accept and sacrifice his future. Deep down, all Ferda wanted was to be accepted as part of his family. Since childhood, the servants had mocked him for training despite having no talent. They called him weak, sickly, pathetic. No one ever took his side. Ferda chose to endure it all in silence. He kept giving his best every day, even with everything stacked against him. Every time he trained, he glanced toward his father, hoping for even a flicker of pride or recognition. In the end, all Ferda ever wanted was to be valued and acknowledged by his own family. That hope shattered again when one of his brothers came to mock him. His brother told him he'd lost his mind for still insisting on training. Moments later, Ferda was beaten to the ground and humiliated in front of everyone. He was told he never had the right to become a knight in the first place. They even called him a disgusting outcast. All he had ever wanted was to be accepted by his family. Then Ferda looked toward the window. What he saw there hurt even more. His father simply turned his back and walked away without a shred of concern. That was when Ferda finally understood. Everyone in that house had already abandoned him long ago. Not long after, Ferda gathered his courage and went to see his father in his study. He told him he'd decided to leave the family for good. His father only stared back with eyes as cold as ice, showing no emotion, no affection at all. He agreed to the decision without hesitation. Before long, Ferda stood at the family estate's gate at midnight. Before he left, his father warned him he was no longer part of the Rosnova family, effective immediately. Ferda's body shook as he held back his rage. He remembered that his father had always known exactly how hard he'd been trying. The hatred he'd buried for so long finally exploded, uncontrollable. His eyes burned with a terrifying hunger for revenge. Right then, Ferda swore he would never forgive his father for everything he'd done to him. At that exact moment, a mysterious red magic circle appeared around him. His overflowing emotions had awakened a magical power that had been dormant all along. He vowed to make his father regret ever casting him out. That very day, at 18 years old, Ferda officially awakened as a mage. But the other mage students only laughed at him while he was still on the ground. They mocked him for being too old to become a mage. They even questioned whether he was smart enough to understand magic at all. Everyone else relied on ki as their base power, so Ferda ignored their taunts. He unleashed an overwhelming amount of mana, enough to send everyone into a panic. The red magic circle appeared again. Ferda revealed his mana came entirely from hatred and the desire for revenge. The dark energy he'd gathered triggered a massive explosion on the spot. That was when Ferda realized something. The more he hated someone, the stronger his magic became. His hatred pushed him all the way to the 6th circle. From there, he had only one goal left. Returned to the Rosnova estate, Ferda used his new power to turn the servants who once mocked him against each other, forcing them to destroy one another without mercy. He then planted deep hatred in both his brothers until they despised each other. Ferda simply watched as the two of them fought until they destroyed each other. Finally, Ferda stood before his father, the man he hated most. Having lost everything, his father begged him to end his suffering quickly. Ferda forced him to watch the Rosnova family, the one he'd built and taken so much pride in, crumble with his own eyes. The horrifying sight broke his father's mind completely. From that point on, everything tied to the Rosnova family vanished from the world. His revenge was complete, but Ferda still didn't feel satisfied. Many powerful and influential figures across the continent eventually joined forces to stop him. They surrounded him, declared him the continent's greatest enemy, and swore they would bring him to justice. But Ferda survived, again. He even pushed through to the 8th circle, the highest level of magic a human could reach, becoming an archmage. Even with power that immense, Ferda knew plenty of people still hated him and would eventually come for revenge. So he set his sights on the 9th circle, the realm of demigods, the power that would make him absolute. After digging through countless ancient tomes, he finally found the last piece he needed to get there. But when he read the page, Ferda froze. He could only wonder if everything written there was some cruel joke fate had prepared for him. The last material Ferda needed to reach the 9th circle turned out to be the heart of the red dragon, Archduke Valdrova. Valdrova only smiled bitterly at that. Fate really did love toying with people, she thought. There was something deeply ironic about it. The man once arranged to marry her was now here to take her life. Ferda spat blood and gritted his teeth. His body was already covered in wounds from the brutal fight. Burning with rage, he demanded Valdrova stop resisting and accept her death. Valdrova admitted she knew people called her a tyrant, but she didn't understand why Ferda hated her so much. She'd lived isolated from everyone her whole life and never understood why humans saw her as an enemy. That set Ferda off. He asked if Valdrova really believed she'd never done anything wrong. His voice full of fury, Ferda laid it out. Valdrova's obsession with finding a human mate was the exact reason he'd been thrown out of his family. Valdrova just stared back, confused, and asked if that was really her fault. Ferda didn't hesitate. Yes, he said, all of it was her fault. A dragon's greed for a human mate had destroyed his entire life. Valdrova took that in, then said quietly that she finally understood everything now. That calm reaction only made Ferda more suspicious. He had no idea what the dragon was actually thinking. But the pause gave him just enough time to gather his mana. A moment later, Valdrova raised her claw and lunged at him. Caught off guard, Ferda threw up a magic barrier to block the strike. The impact was massive. Blood splattered across Ferda's face, but when he looked closer, he realized the blood wasn't his. It was Valdrova's, torn from her own chest by her own claw. Ferda froze. He couldn't understand why the dragon would wound herself. Calmly, Valdrova asked if Ferda's magic truly required a dragon's heart. That question made it click. Ferda understood her intention instantly. He screamed at her to stop. That heart was his only hope of completing his magic. But Valdrova kept going, slowly tearing open her own chest. Ferda was racing against time now. If the heart got damaged, everything he'd worked for would be for nothing. He fired off a spell to stop her. The attack landed and the massive dragon's body was thrown backward. Even so, Ferda panicked. Valdrova's claw was still buried in her own chest. When the dragon's body finally collapsed to the ground, dread hit Ferda hard. He feared the precious heart had been destroyed. But as he focused his eyes, a blinding flash of gold caught his attention. Relief flooded him. The heart was still intact right in front of him. In a calm voice, Valdrova told him to take it. Ferda could only stand there in silence, unable to make sense of what she'd just done. He asked why Valdrova would do this when she could have kept fighting. Valdrova answered that once she knew the whole truth, she realized her own existence only brought Ferda suffering. Slowly, Valdrova reflected on the lonely life she'd lived. She admitted she'd always hated herself and the dragon blood running through her veins. She was sick of the destructive instinct that always pushed her to destroy things for no reason. That monster inside her was the thing she despised most. In the past, every time she turned human, her presence alone brought fear and chaos. She knew that just existing was enough to make people tremble. Valdrova said she regretted ever wanting to feel happiness. That foolish dream had only caused so many people pain. A single tear slipped from the giant dragon's eye in the darkness. Since everyone around her had been hurt because of her, Valdrova said she hoped Ferda could find happiness through her sacrifice. With those final words, the massive dragon's body slowly went still and collapsed onto the dark ground, lifeless. A strange tightness settled in Ferda's chest. He didn't even understand what he was feeling. The victory he'd dreamed of for so long left nothing but a bitter taste. Furious, Ferda shouted that Valdrova was still messing with his head even with her dying breath. He forced his mind back to the goal. The ninth circle was finally right in front of him. Ferda raised the dragon's heart, glowing gold in his hands. If he could absorb its full power at once, he was certain he'd surpass human limits, be reborn as a feared demigod, and gain absolute power. Then, without warning, a massive explosion of light and dust swallowed the entire area. In an instant, everything around him changed completely. Ferda found himself floating, without a single thread of clothing, inside an endless, dark void. He was confused. He was certain he'd absorbed the dragon's heart perfectly. And yet, the sensation felt like he kept sinking deeper and deeper into a bottomless swamp. Ferda started to wonder if he was falling endlessly just as a side effect of absorbing the dragon's heart. Then, out of nowhere, a wave of emotions that weren't his own crashed into his mind. A bolt of magic lightning struck through his skull in the darkness. That was when it hit him. All those memories and feelings belonged to Valdrova. For the first time, Ferda saw the truth. He understood what was really in the dragon's heart. There, he witnessed a despair so deep it made his own suffering feel meaningless. But beneath all of it, he also felt a loneliness so quiet and so painful. In that moment, Ferda realized something. All the rage and hatred that had driven him to hunt Valdrova down suddenly felt so small. Tears started falling as Ferda began questioning what he'd actually done. He asked himself again what he truly wanted. To become an archmage? To get revenge? To become a demigod? Then a memory surfaced, him as a kid, sitting alone, drawing on a piece of paper. That was when he finally found his answer. None of it, None of that was what he'd really wanted all along. All he'd ever wanted was to draw his family living together in peace, and to be accepted as part of it. His dream, from the very start, had just been a simple family and a quiet life. He thought back to Valdrova's human form. With his heart full of regret, he wondered if the dragon had carried the same simple dream all along. Ferda finally understood. This entire journey chasing power and revenge had meant nothing. Valdrova had died by his own hand, and that made every single thing he'd achieved feel completely hollow. Tears of regret kept streaming down his face. Then he remembered something else. A ninth circle mage could only cast one spell, the wish spell. Even knowing it was probably too late, Ferda decided to use that ultimate magic inside the circle of light surrounding him. Suddenly, a voice he knew all too well called out his name. Ferda's eyes snapped open. He looked around and realized he was back in his family's lavish study. His father, Arambalt Roznova, stood in front of him, scolding him for zoning out mid-conversation. Ferda immediately remembered. This man had lost his mind before he died. That's when he started piecing together exactly what day this was. A moment later, his father repeated the exact words Ferda knew by heart. His engagement to Archduke Valdrova was final. His father stated flatly that Ferda must already understand the consequences of that decision. Arambalt warned him that if he refused, the Roznova family would take action. Hearing that, Ferda stepped forward, eyes wide with shock. He'd actually gone back in time. Without hesitation, he cut his father off and told him he understood everything perfectly. This time, he swore he wouldn't run. Firmly, Ferda accepted the engagement to Archduke Valdrova. That decision immediately shocked the Roznova family's second son, Hukin Roznova. He asked a servant if he'd heard wrong. In his mind, Ferda wasn't the type to walk willingly toward his own destruction. The head servant explained that Ferda really was preparing to leave, but before that, he'd sent every servant out and locked himself in his room. Hearing that, Hukin smirked, twisted with satisfaction. He decided to go see it himself, to enjoy his brother's despair up close. Meanwhile, inside his room, Ferda calmly went about getting ready. Suddenly, Hukin kicked the door open and shouted, demanding to know why he wasn't gone yet. But the second he stepped in, he froze. He hadn't expected to find Ferda dressed and completely composed. Hukin had been so sure he'd walk in on his brother sobbing in fear. Ferda just looked at him calmly and called him out for barging into someone's room without knocking. When Hukin asked, confused, how he'd managed to dress himself, Ferda explained he'd sent the servants home on purpose to start getting used to living without their help. That shift in attitude only made Hukin more suspicious. He asked if Ferda actually understood what this engagement meant. Still calm, Ferda said he understood it completely. To him, it meant getting cast out of the family. Hukin laughed coldly and told him what was waiting for him wasn't just exile, it was total annihilation. He asked if Ferda knew why the position of Archduke Valdrova's husband had always stayed empty. With a cold, determined stare, Ferda said he knew everything already. Valdrova's first fiancé had been the empire's third prince. He was known as flawless, brilliant, and handsome, and he'd even given up his claim to the throne just to propose to her. But just one day after arriving in the dragon's territory for the engagement, he was found in a horrifying state. His eyes were empty, lifeless, and his body was beaten nearly beyond recognition. Hearing that, Hukin pointed at Ferda and asked if he was really sure he could survive something even a prince hadn't. Hukin just shrugged. He had no interest in stopping some idiot who was voluntarily walking straight into a dragon's mouth. Still, he gave a sharp warning. If Ferda tried to run, Hukin would take his head himself before Valdrova ever got the chance. Ferda looked at his brother with pure contempt. Flatly, he suggested Hukin learn to control his temper. Then he went further, openly calling out the way Hukin kept sneaking glances at their eldest brother's wife. That set Hukin off. He lunged forward, furious. Ferda just smiled coldly and told him to back off. His face was too valuable to risk damaging now, especially with such a long road ahead to Valdrova's territory. After a calm goodbye, Ferda headed straight for the carriage. The old butler who'd served the Roznova family for years broke down sobbing, covering his face with a handkerchief. Between sobs, he said it had been an honor serving Ferda all these years. Ferda knew exactly how fake that was. If the man really felt honored, he never would have poisoned his food. Thinking back on his childhood, Ferda finally understood something. His frail body had never been natural. Even the servants had never been on his side. Not once, not from the start. That realization brought a deep disgust bubbling back up. For a second, Ferda wanted to strangle the butler right there. Instead, he just patted the old man's shoulder and thanked him for his years of hard work. With a pointed edge in his voice, he added that it couldn't have been easy serving him all this time. The butler stiffened instantly. Before stepping into the carriage, Ferda told him to take good care of the family while he was gone. Once he settled into his seat, Ferda noticed how calm his mind felt. Probably because in his last life, he'd already gotten his revenge on everyone. He leaned his head back, watching the scenery shift outside the window. For the first time, the rage and thirst for vengeance that had once filled his chest were completely gone. He realized something else too. The red magic born from hatred worked exactly like poison. At first, that power had felt intoxicating, but the more he used it, the more his body adapted, until the power spiraled completely out of control. Without him even noticing, it had poisoned his own mind and soul. Back when madness had consumed him, everything had felt thrilling, addictive even. But now, Ferda didn't want that life anymore. A life built on nothing but hatred and emptiness. After everything, he could finally feel real peace. Not long after the journey ended, the coachman called out to him, voice shaking, and said they'd arrived. In the middle of the forest stood a wooden sign marking the start of the Duke's territory, with a warning that no one was allowed to enter. Ferda stepped down from the carriage and sat casually on his luggage to wait. The coachman quickly spurred his horses and took off. From a distance, he shouted, hoping Ferda would stay safe and alive. Ferda actually felt more at ease with no one watching over him. If some wild beast showed up, he figured his fourth circle power was more than enough to handle it. Just then, the wind picked up sharp and sudden, scattering leaves through the air. Ferda's attention snapped toward the trees. Through the dense forest, he spotted the silhouette of a girl standing still. A moment later, she stepped out, dressed in a maid's uniform, and introduced herself as Ruri, Valdrova's loyal servant. Politely, she asked if he was Ferda Rosnova. Ferda nodded and confirmed it. Ruri motioned for him to follow her toward the castle. For as long as anyone could remember, the people of the Arkan Empire had bragged about their own strength while conveniently ignoring their weaknesses. What they ignored was this. At the eastern edge of the continent lay demon territory, a land crawling with monsters no one could ever tame. It was Valdrova, the Red Dragon, who single-handedly held that invasion back and guarded the entire board alone. Thinking about that, Ferda realized just how unfair Valdrova's reputation really was. She was the one holding the last line of defense for the whole continent. As they pushed deeper into the forest and wolves began appearing around them, Ferda thought back to all the slander he'd heard over the years. Plenty of people accused Valdrova of secretly building a monster army to attack humans. But Ferda knew the truth. Those cowards would never dare say that to her face. Noticing Ferda watching the monsters nearby, Ruri turned and told him not to worry. She activated a glowing protective barrier and assured him the beasts wouldn't attack as long as he stayed close to her. Ferda asked how much longer they had until they reached the castle. Calmly, Ruri answered they still had about 2 hours of walking left. Hearing that, Ferda immediately started wondering how Ruri had managed to get there so fast in the first place. Casually, Ruri explained that if she traveled alone and flew, the trip would only take about 10 seconds. That answer only confirmed what Ferda had already suspected. Ruri wasn't an ordinary maid, she was a high-tier dragon spawn, born with extraordinary physical strength and magic. She was just hiding her horns and tail to blend in with humans. Knowing that, Ferda planted his wooden staff firmly into the ground. He suggested they just fly straight to the dragon's lair. Ruri shot back, asking if she was supposed to carry him the whole way. Ferda said he could fly just fine on his own, but Ruri immediately shut that down. Flatly, she told him she had zero interest in carrying him anywhere. The two of them fell into silence, walking back through the dense forest. Starting to tire, Ferda suggested they take a short break. Ruri didn't hesitate, she told him to keep moving. Her mistress was already waiting. Ferda's face went blank with resignation. He knew he had no choice but to push through the long journey. Privately, he thought the road to marriage really was never easy. After walking for a long stretch, they finally arrived at the gates of a massive castle. Ruri knocked and announced loudly that the Duke's future spouse had arrived. Instantly, Ferda felt an overwhelming pressure radiating from inside the castle. That terrifying aura made it clear just how immense the dragon's presence really was. Ruri told Ferda to wait outside while she delivered the news to her mistress. But Ferda asked to speak with Valdrova directly instead. Ruri's expression sharpened immediately. Her voice edged with anger. She asked, since when someone like him thought he had the right to meet the Duke face to face. A while later, Ruri came back out with Valdrova's answer. First, she thanked Ferda for coming all this way, despite knowing exactly what risk that meant. Then she delivered the real message. The Duke had no interest whatsoever in going through with a forced engagement. Ferda was genuinely surprised, being sent home after a journey like that. He knew that in his past life, he would have taken that offer without a second thought. But this time was different. This time, he'd come here by his own choice. Firmly, Ferda said he had no intention of leaving. He still wanted to go through with the engagement. He asked Ruri to relay that answer to Valdrova. Reluctant, the maid went back inside. A moment later, Ruri returned carrying a huge sack stuffed with gold coins. She dropped it in front of him and said the Duke admired his courage. All that wealth was his, if he needed it. Ruri explained it was more than enough to leave this place and start a new life somewhere else. But Ferda just looked at the pile of gold, completely unmoved. Calmly, he reached out and explained the real reason he'd come. He made it clear, he had no interest in money or power. The only thing he wanted was to follow through on his engagement to Valdrova. Seeing him refuse to budge, Ruri closed her eyes and let out a long, frustrated breath. Suddenly, she clenched her fist and slammed it into the air, furious. Pointing at Ferda, she ordered him to leave, for good right now. Ferda pointed out that the answer she'd just given sounded way too short to actually be Valdrova's. That's when Ruri admitted it. Every word had come from her, not the Duke. As her anger spiked, horns began sprouting from her head and her nails sharpened into claws. Ruri unleashed her full green magical aura, and a massive reptilian tail came into view. A crushing wave of pressure swept through the area. Ferda scrambled to shield himself from it. That was when he realized this was true dragon fear. Ruri slammed him to the ground with ease, letting her fury pour out. To her, a human like him was nothing but trash, consumed by ambition. Pinned down and helpless, Ferda finally understood why the third prince had met such a horrifying end. Ruri confirmed his suspicion. She explained the prince had only wanted the marriage as a way to control and conquer the dragon. To her, he'd been nothing but a fool who thought he could hide his own greed. Ruri stepped closer and admitted his predecessor had been arrogant, through and through. She pressed her claw into Ferda's chest, pinning him to the ground, and said she saw no difference between him and the prince. Then she asked if he really wanted to end up with the same tragic fate. Even pinned down in real danger, Ferda only answered with a faint, confident smile. That reaction caught Ruri off guard. With complete sincerity, Ferda swore every word he'd said was true. No one had forced him to come here, he said, and he wasn't chasing profit or any personal agenda. Ferda thought back to his last life. Back then, Valdrova had given up her own heart to save a selfish man like him. Because of that, this time, Ferda swore he'd stand by the dragon's side. Loud and clear, he stated he'd come here to become Valdrova's future husband. He even added that if they were really getting married, Valdrova should be the one speaking to him directly, not passing messages through a maid. That comment made Ruri's hands shake with rage. To her, Ferda's boldness had crossed a line. She lunged at him, claws drawn, screaming at him to stop talking nonsense. But right before her attack landed, her body suddenly froze mid-air. Slowly, she pulled her claw back and stepped away. Her voice tight, she asked for permission to step away for a moment. Ferda just nodded calmly. Once inside the castle, Ruri relayed every single word Ferda had said to her mistress, without leaving anything out. After kneeling in respect, she confirmed that was exactly what the young man had said. Before her stood the dragon who ruled that entire territory. Archduke Valdrova, in her elegant human form, looked genuinely surprised by the report. Curious, the red-haired woman asked if Ferda had really said all that. Valdrova was starting to get interested, wondering what kind of man could have that much nerve. Ruri explained that Ferda was actually incredibly weak. In her words, the guy looked like he was about to pass out just from the walk to the castle. Dismissively, she said he didn't deserve any of this and suggested they just throw him out. But one sharp look from Valdrova shut her down instantly. Flustered, she apologized and admitted, well, he was pretty handsome at least. Valdrova just stared back, unimpressed. That clearly wasn't the answer she was looking for. Ruri let out a long breath before finally explaining herself seriously. She said Ferda genuinely wasn't an ordinary human. As a dragon spawn, she could terrify most humans with her aura alone. But Ferda hadn't shown a trace of fear, not even after she'd unleashed her full dragon fear on him. Because of that, Ruri believed he might be the first human ever capable of looking Valdrova in the eye without flinching. Hearing that report, Valdrova smiled faintly, then let out a quiet laugh. That reaction genuinely stunned Ruri. Looking pleased, the Duchess said she really liked Ferda's attitude. Finally, a human who could look at her directly. That meant they could actually talk to each other like two normal people, no fear involved. Ruri could only repeat her mistress's words back, completely confused. To her, Valdrova wanting something as ordinary as a normal relationship felt bizarre. But Valdrova just nodded gently, and Ruri accepted the order without arguing further. Not long after, Ruri went back to Ferda and told him Valdrova had decided to move forward with the engagement. She then led him toward the guest room that would be his. Stepping inside, Ferda was surprised. The room was far cleaner and more comfortable than he'd expected. He asked who'd been maintaining the entire castle. With clear pride, Ruri explained that besides Valdrova, she was the only one living there. She was the sole servant serving the dragon. Then Ruri made something clear again. Ferda was just a guest, nothing more. That word struck Ferda as strange. Ruri quickly clarified until the official wedding took place, his status really was nothing beyond guest. Watching how guarded Ruri stayed, Ferda thought she looked exactly like a loyal guard dog watching over her master. He asked when the engagement ceremony would take place. Ruri explained it would be a simple affair, nothing extravagant. It would happen exactly 1 month from now, at the dragon's lair. Ferda listened to the whole explanation carefully and agreed without any objection, but privately, he started counting. He only had 1 month before the wedding day arrived. Ruri kept staring at him, arms crossed, still clearly suspicious. She warned him that no one here would just hand him recognition for free. The deadline existed so he could prove he deserved it. Pointing at him, she made it clear. Within 30 days, he needed to earn a status worthy of being Valdrova's partner. That condition caught Ferda a little off guard. Apparently, being Valdrova's fiancé wasn't enough on its own. He still had to prove he actually met the standard. Privately, Ferda could only sigh. Marriage, it turned out, was way more complicated than he'd imagined. He asked if this requirement had come from Valdrova herself. Ruri shook her head and admitted it was entirely her own decision. In her view, the Duchess was too kind, too quick to forgive anyone. But Ruri herself wasn't about to let just anyone live in that castle. Ruri made it clear, weak body or not, Ferda would have to prove his potential through actual results. If he failed that test, he'd never be recognized as a worthy match for the dragon. Hearing the challenge, Ferda closed his eyes for a moment, thinking it over. His blue gaze opened again with a faint smile. Privately, Ferda thought his future wife really did have incredible people around her. He admired Ruri's loyalty, always putting her mistress's safety first, always demanding the highest standard for anyone who wanted to stand beside Valdrova. But at the same time, he couldn't shake a bitter thought. Where were followers like this when Valdrova needed them most, back in his last life? Ferda accepted the challenge. Half joking, he asked if he needed to become an emperor to be considered worthy. Ruri shook her head and told him he just needed to reach a level where no one could look down on him. Ferda smiled at that. On the surface, it sounded simple, but the weight behind it was much heavier. He'd have to prove potential that surpassed even an emperor's. Still, he accepted every condition and said he understood completely. Ruri kept glaring at him, clearly annoyed. She genuinely couldn't understand how a human could stay this calm in such a dangerous situation. Sharply, she asked if he thought dragons were easy to deal with, or if something was actually wrong with his head. Ferda just shook his head, relaxed, and told her not to worry. Within a month, he'd prove exactly what he was capable of. Ruri kept watching him, still deeply suspicious. She had no idea where a human like him got that much confidence. Night fell over Grand Duchess Valdrova's castle. Under the light of the full moon, Ferda paced back and forth in his room, thinking through how to prove himself. Right now, he didn't have a single trace of magic. He reminded himself how rare mages actually were, and that he was the only person who'd ever reached the 9th circle. With that experience behind him, he believed he could reclaim all his old abilities, if he could find that same emotional state again. For a mage, the first circle was the most critical stage, the foundation for every mana pathway in the body. A blue circle formed through calm, stable meditation, the path most mages chose. A red circle, on the other hand, formed from hatred and violent emotion, the dangerous path that had once nearly cost Ferda his sanity as an archmage. He knew choosing that same path again would make him powerful much faster, but this time, he chose differently, so he wouldn't lose himself the way he had before. A week passed. Under a clear midday sky, Ferda sat cross-legged on his floor, meditating. He focused everything he had, and slowly a faint blue light began to glow between his palms. Then, just as quickly, it scattered into nothing. Ferda let out a tired breath, another failed attempt. He knew forming a blue circle usually took about 3 years. At first, he'd assumed his past life experience would speed things up dramatically. Reality wasn't cooperating. With only about 3 weeks left, Ruri suddenly walked into his room and asked if he was actually putting in real effort. Ferda nodded and said he was trying, but Ruri glanced at the food on his table and grumbled that she hadn't seen any change in him at all. Ferda kept eating calmly and said it would all work out as long as he kept trying. That answer only irritated her more, and she went quiet. After finishing his meal, Ferda privately admitted he hadn't made any real progress. He needed a different approach. Just then, a massive tremor shook the entire room, startling him. He asked what was happening. Ruri explained that Valdrova was out hunting monsters at that exact moment. Ferda looked surprised. Ruri added that the Duchess personally handled every monster coming from the Eastern Territory. Hearing that, Ferda looked out the window and quietly said Valdrova's name. A moment later, he stood up, determined, and told Ruri he wanted to see the battle for himself. Ruri flatly refused. He asked why he wasn't allowed to come. Dead serious, she told him an ordinary human couldn't withstand the pressure of a fight like that. She even mocked him, telling him to just stay put, unless he wanted to humiliate himself before the engagement ceremony even happened. That set Ferda off. He slammed his palm on the table and rejected the idea outright. To him, witnessing that battle was a responsibility, something the future partner of Valdrova owed her. Seeing him refuse to back down, Ruri finally gave in. She spread her dragon wings and flew off through the sky, carrying him with her. A short while later, they landed in an open field. Ruri said they'd arrived. The instant his feet touched the ground, Ferda dropped to his knees, fighting back nausea. Ruri's flying speed was on another level. It felt less like flying and more like teleporting. Still clutching his stomach, queasy from the flight, Ferda complained about how rough that trip had been on his body. Ruri didn't care at all. Sharp and direct, she told him to focus on the real reason they were there. She ordered him to stand up and look ahead. The two of them stood at the edge of a cliff. Below stretched a massive valley, blanketed in thick purple mist. When Ferda focused his eyes on the bottom of the ravine, they went wide. He hadn't expected that dark valley to be crawling with giant monsters. Privately, he wondered if this was where Valdrova was fighting. Down in the darkness, monsters clashed in a battle violent enough to shake the ground. Suddenly, a massive red dragon burst out of a fiery explosion and tore through the sky. Two giant serpents lunged at her, letting out horrifying roars. But Valdrova tore through one monster's hide with ease using her claws. A moment later, she sank her teeth into its neck, while flames began gathering inside her mouth. That heat kept building in her throat until it lit up the entire battlefield. In an instant, she unleashed a blast of fire that obliterated everything in front of her. A sea of flames swallowed the whole area below. The shockwave and heat even reached the cliff where they stood. Even so, Ruri stood completely still, unshaken. Not long after, Valdrova let out a massive roar. That sound turned into a shockwave that rattled the entire valley. The second that pressure hit him, cold sweat broke out across Ferda's body. He shook violently and dropped to his knees. For the first time, he truly understood how insane his future wife's power actually was. The aura carried in that roar alone was enough to shake anyone standing anywhere near it. Gripping his chest, trying to steady his breathing, Ferda fought to hold on. Watching him, Ruri asked if he finally understood reality now. Coldly, she said it was almost funny, an ordinary human dreaming of becoming a dragon's partner. She pointed toward Valdrova, still fighting in the distance, and said that was the true form of the woman he'd chosen as his life partner. Ruri's gaze dropped to Ferda's hand, still pressed against the ground. She could see his body shaking violently from the dragon fear pressure. Privately, she thought, this was exactly what she'd expected. That was the whole reason she'd tried to stop him from coming in the first place. Ruri went on to explain. Red dragon blood carried an inherently violent nature. They were creatures built with a destructive instinct, unable to exist without unleashing that power. That rage was part of who they were from birth. She asked again if he now understood just how dangerous it was to live beside a dragon every single day. In her view, humans and dragons could never truly be equals. Sooner or later, she said, even Valdrova would realize the engagement was nothing but a pointless dream. But against all expectation, Ferda lifted his head and smiled. Quietly, he said everything he'd just witnessed was genuinely incredible. That response stopped Ruri cold. What she saw in his eyes wasn't fear. It was pure, genuine awe at the dragon before them. Without meaning to, she took a step back. One thought crossed her mind. Maybe this human really had lost his mind. Night settled over the castle again. The moon glowed calmly under a sky full of stars. Lying in bed, Ferda replayed the day's events in his head. Even though he'd braced himself beforehand, the pressure he'd felt had gone far beyond anything he'd imagined. His whole body still ached from taking the full force of Valdrova's dragon fear and roar head-on. He remembered how Ruri had had to fly him home, visibly exhausted herself from pushing that kind of speed. Ferda felt genuinely lucky. His mind was still intact. He knew he couldn't let the day pass without gaining something from it. He started asking himself why he'd pushed so hard to see that battle in the first place. Every scene from the valley replayed vividly in his mind. Then suddenly, something clicked. As terrifying as that sight had been, Ferda realized that deep down, what he actually wanted was to keep watching his future wife up close. He remembered how Valdrova had hidden her true form out at the eastern border, tearing through monster after monster without pause. That was when he understood the real reason. She did all of it to protect the things that mattered most to her. To Ferda, that resolve wasn't so different from the path of a true knight, someone who chose to carry that burden on their own. Ferda spread his arms and let the night breeze drift over him. A faint smile crossed his face. It was, he thought, genuinely remarkable. Someone as powerful as Valdrova was willing to let him stand by her side. A powerful red energy started gathering in Ferda's hands. He froze, startled, he recognized it instantly. This was a red circle. Panic hit him. He tried to suppress the mana flow. He knew exactly what mistake he couldn't repeat from his last life. This power had to be stopped. But as he studied the red mana flow more closely, something caught his attention. Valdrova's image, clad in red armor, filled his mind with startling clarity. His heart pounded harder every time he pictured the dragon's fierce form in battle. Strangely, the more he replayed her fight in his head, the clearer his mana pathways became. What he felt this time wasn't hatred or vengeance at all. Ferda sat down to meditate right away, trying to understand this unfamiliar emotion filling him before it slipped away. He focused every bit of his awareness, then began compressing and spinning the red mana at high speed between his palms. A bright red light flared, wrapping around his entire body as he held his concentration steady. With full resolve, he poured everything he had into forming one perfect magic circle. It worked. A red circle formed, flawless, but the energy it produced felt completely different from before. Ferda smiled faintly, staring at the magic circle. Privately, he made himself a promise. This new life wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. The next morning, Ruri walked into his room and stopped cold. Disbelief written on her face, she asked if he'd really activated a mana pathway in a single night. Ferda complimented her sharp eye. As she kept pressing him, demanding to know how he'd pulled off something that should have been impossible, he just answered casually that he wasn't exactly ordinary, then turned it back on her, asking what she thought of the progress. Reluctantly, Ruri admitted he'd met the requirement she'd set. Even so, Ferda knew he still had a long road ahead. After finishing his meal, Ferda folded his napkin with a serious look and asked if there was somewhere he could train. A short while later, they arrived at a training field. A straw dummy, Ice, stood in the middle of the sandy ground as a target. Ruri showed up carrying a broom and proudly announced she'd set up the entire training area exactly as he'd asked. Ferda gave a small round of applause, praising her efficiency, getting all of this done solo in just half a day. Ruri, on the other hand, was confused. Why request something as basic as a straw dummy instead of expensive training gear? Ferda explained he didn't need fancy equipment. He needed to train controlling mana as efficiently as possible. Ruri still looked puzzled. To dragons, she said, controlling mana was as natural as breathing. Ferda laughed a little and said humans would probably find that mindset pretty ridiculous. Ruri proudly reminded him she was, in fact, part dragon herself. Ferda paused, studying her for a moment. Privately, he thought people born with natural power like that would never truly understand what humans had to fight for. Still, he invited her to watch his training anyway. Ferda understood the foundation of mana control was stability, the principle most blue circle mages relied on. But this time, he'd chosen to awaken a red circle instead. That meant he had to stir up his emotions and control them at the same time. Only by mastering that contradiction could his true power emerge. In his last life, it had taken him a full year just to draw mana from a current of hatred. After that, another full year to compress it into a single mana orb. That whole exhausting process was now a resource he could draw on. Thanks to that memory, this time it only took him 2 minutes to create the exact same mana projectile. Ruri watched the whole thing, eyes wide. She couldn't understand how he'd managed to control mana that perfectly and form a stable energy orb on his very first try. Ignoring her shock, Ferda raised his hand again. 3 more red mana orbs formed instantly, hovering calmly around his palm. He pointed his fingers at the row of targets and gave a short command to fire. All 4 projectiles shot forward like lightning, cutting through the air and leaving glowing red trails behind them. A second later, a loud explosion rocked the field. The straw dummy in front of them shattered into pieces after taking a direct hit dead center. Looking at the result, Ferda stared down at his own hands with a faint smile. His magic, he realized, hadn't faded at all. Ruri just stood there in silence, her expression far more serious than before. She started reassessing the man in front of her after watching that flawless display of power. A short while later, Ruri met with Valdrova inside a cave and gave her a full report on Ferda, successfully awakening his magic in record time. The Grand Duchess admitted she didn't fully grasp how impressive that achievement was, then asked how Ruri would rate her future fiancé. Ruri reported to Valdrova that Ferda had passed every single test flawlessly, without a single slip-up. That was exactly why she thought he was dangerous. In her view, no human could perform that perfectly without hiding something. Annoyed, she even guessed Ferda might just be some weirdo who got off on suffering. Hearing the report, Valdrova only smiled faintly. She found it almost amusing that Ruri had actually come around to praising a human. Reluctant as she was, Ruri admitted Ferda had genuinely exceeded her expectations. The Grand Duchess told her servant to stop worrying so much. She decided to trust the sincerity Ferda had shown since day one, but Ruri still remembered clearly how her mistress had been hurt by a human before. She was determined to protect Valdrova's heart from going through that same disappointment again. So she proposed giving Ferda one important task, a real test of his intentions. Valdrova liked the idea and asked her to lay out the plan. Not long after, Ferda appeared in a crisp red noble's outfit as his arrival was formally announced. In the grand meeting hall, the region's nobles had already gathered after receiving a sudden summons from the Grand Duchess. Some grumbled about being pulled into a meeting while monster attacks were still an active threat. Before long, the conversation shifted to Valdrova's new fiancé. One noble looked genuinely shocked that anyone had actually accepted what he called an insane proposal. Mocking whispers spread through the room instantly. They dismissed Ferdas as some weak kid who couldn't even handle a sword properly, despite coming from a noble family. An elder seated at the head of the room joined in the sneering, confident the boy wouldn't last long enough to be worth worrying about. Count Olvera chimed in too, certain the future groom would end up torn apart by the dragon sooner or later. Then the hall doors swung open, and the formal announcement rang out. The Grand Duchess's fiancé had arrived. Calm and composed, Ferda walked in with elegant posture, Ruri right behind him. Before the meeting, Ferda had asked Ruri in the library if he really had to face the region's rulers directly. Ruri told him it was mandatory. She reminded him exactly why Valdrova held the title of Grand Duchess. Years ago, Valdrova had personally killed the Black Dragon Godwin, a feat that earned her control over this entire territory. Now, the Duchess spent most of her time hunting monsters at the eastern border. That meant her future husband would need to handle all the governing duties in her place. In short, Valdrova guarded against outside threats, while Ferda would be responsible for everything happening inside the territory. Ferda understood immediately. This was a test of his leadership, and he accepted it without hesitation. Back in the hall, Ferda formally introduced himself as the future partner of Grand Duchess Valdrova. Without a shred of hesitation, he looked across the room at every noble with a cold, steady gaze, then asked a single question. How did they want to be treated by him? That blunt question froze the entire room. The nobles realized instantly, this wasn't someone easily pushed around. Count Olvera answered first, smiling thinly. He said everyone in that room was a noble loyal to the Grand Duchess, and that alone earned her future partner their respect. But, he added, there were still a few conditions worth discussing. He reminded Ferda they'd sworn loyalty to the Empire long before he was even born. With a pointed edge, Olvera suggested it was actually Ferda who owed them respect, given their years of experience. Ferda listened to all of it without changing his expression. After a beat of silence, he asked again, was that really their final answer on how they wanted to be treated? His cold stare turned the whole room tense. He told them to stop dancing around the question and just answer him directly. Under the weight of that stare, Count Olvera swallowed hard before finally backing down. Reluctantly, he admitted the Grand Duchess's future partner did have the authority to speak to them that way. Ferda then stated that after the marriage, the governing structure wouldn't change overnight. Every territory would still be run by the same nobles currently in charge. Hearing that, one noble shot to his feet and slammed the table. Furious, he accused Ferda of implying that local rulers had been oppressing and exploiting their own people. Ferda just raised a hand and apologized with a faint smile as if it had all been a minor slip of the tongue. That casual response only made the man angrier. He sneered that now he understood exactly why Ferda's own family had thrown him out. Pointing directly at him, he mocked Ferda as nothing but a failed Class 1 groom, while he himself was a Class 4 mage, far superior. Ferda just muttered quietly that a Class 4 mage was a decent enough opponent. He said it calmly, like the threat in front of him wasn't even worth worrying about. That set Thessalos off instantly. Jaw clenched, he demanded Ferda repeat what he'd just said. In his mind, Class 4 mages were respected everywhere, their power already proven beyond question. Insulted by a Class 1 mage, Thessalos immediately started gathering mana, ready to teach Ferda a lesson. Facing that incoming attack, Ferda casually raised one hand. Then he made a counter-proposal, one he considered far more interesting. If Thessalos thought so little of Class 1 mages, they might as well settle it right there with a duel. A short while later, the two of them stood in a dueling arena. The nobles immediately started whispering, convinced the outcome was already obvious given the gap in power. Ruri watched silently, while other nobles wondered aloud whether Thessalos would show Ferda any mercy. Wind swept across the wide stone arena as the two opponents faced off in front of the crowd. Ferda stood relaxed, hands still in his pockets. He even asked, straight up, what spell his opponent planned to use. That question only pushed Thessalos further. In his eyes, asking about an opponent's technique before a fight was flat out disrespectful. With a mocking smile, he told Ferda he still had a chance to back out if he was already scared. Moments later, Thessalos announced loudly that he'd end the duel with a Class 4 spell called Magic Explosion. Hearing that name sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. They worried Ferda might not walk out of that arena alive. But Ferda stayed completely calm. He said he only had one technique of his own, Mana Shot. Thessalos burst out laughing. Mana Shot was just a basic spell. Even so, Ferda held his gaze steady, full of confidence. He made it clear he had no intention of losing. Slowly moving his fingers, he added that the knowledge he carried was worth far more than any class ranking. That comment pushed Thessalos over the edge. He funneled every bit of his mana into the ground, and a massive glowing transmutation circle formed beneath his feet, ready to unleash a lethal strike. Ferda recognized it instantly. His opponent was stoking his own emotions to boost his power, the signature move of a red circle user. Without wasting a second, 3 red projectiles shot across the arena at blinding speed. Thessalos' eyes went wide. That attack speed was way beyond anything he'd expected. Controlling his mana with perfect precision, Ferda said calmly that the outcome of this fight had already been decided from the start. The 3 red beams struck their target dead on, tearing straight through his defensive barrier. That's when Thessalos realized Ferda hadn't aimed for his body at all. Every shot had been aimed precisely at the weakest point of his transmutation circle. In an instant, the magic circle shattered into pieces. The resulting shockwave threw Thessalos backward hard. He couldn't believe a Class 1 mage had just destroyed an active magic circle like that. His face went pale. He realized this level of technique was something even he couldn't pull off himself. Thessalos collapsed, bracing himself against the arena floor scattered with dissipating mana. He dropped to his knees, completely drained after his magic flow got cut off. Cold sweat soaked his body, his breathing ragged, and in a shaking voice, he admitted defeat. Ferda walked over calmly and stopped right in front of him. Flatly, he simply asked if Thessalos was finally admitting he'd lost. The man lifted his head, eyes welling up, unable to say a single word in protest. Instead of clinging to his pride, Thessalos admitted the one thing he'd ever truly wanted was to become a stronger mage. He bowed his head in full surrender, saying he'd do anything to gain real power. The nobles could only whisper among themselves, stunned that a Class 4 mage had actually been beaten by a Class 1. Ruri stepped in with a cold warning. Anyone who dared question the legitimacy of Ferda's victory, she said, would lose both their eyes. Thessalos shook Ferda's hand with genuine respect. He praised the young man's extraordinary skill and said the Eastern Territory's military strength was finally in the right hands. Laughing, satisfied, he admitted he was glad to finally be recognized by someone far stronger than him. In his eyes, getting exiled from the capital had turned out to be the biggest blessing of his life. Ferda perked up at the mention of the capital and asked for the man's full name. The moment he heard Thessalos Vulture, something clicked in his memory. His gaze sharpened, and he muttered quietly that he finally remembered exactly who this man was. With a serious expression, Ferda said something that left Thessalos completely confused. In his last life, this man had once been someone who'd done him a great service. Before Thessalos could even process what that meant, Ferda raised a single finger and pressed it right to the center of the man's forehead. His gaze stayed calm. In a quiet voice, he gave the command again, mana shot. A massive blast tore through Thessalos at point-blank range. His body flew backward, thrown by the sheer force of the spell. Every noble watching the duel froze, eyes wide. None of them could believe what they'd just seen. Thessalos' body hit the arena floor, covered in blood, no longer moving. Ferda stood there watching him, his expression completely unchanged. He knew the decision was brutal, but in his memory, this was the man who would one day bring devastating suffering to Valdrova. That was exactly why he'd chosen to end it before that future ever had the chance to happen. In the tense silence that followed, Ferda turned and walked away from the body without a shred of remorse. The nobles could only stare at his back, gripped with fear. Trembling whispers spread through the crowd as they realized Ferda had just killed a fellow noble. Many believed the duel had technically already ended, and that this act couldn't be justified. Still, not one of them dared step forward to challenge him. Ferda turned back toward them with a faint smile. He asked why everyone looked so tense. In his view, Thessalos had earned that fate. Left alive, the man would one day bring suffering to the Grand Duchess. That comment stunned Count Olvera. He demanded to know how Ferda could possibly draw that conclusion, given this was the first time they'd ever met. With a smile heavy with meaning, Ferda explained, his future wife had always hoped humans could live in peace. Dragon or not, Valdrova kept fighting to protect humanity. Thessalos' future actions, he said, would directly betray everything she stood for. Unfortunately, none of it would happen until much later, so there was no way to prove it right now. That explanation only confused the nobles further. To them, Ferda sounded like a madman, killing someone over a crime that hadn't even happened yet. But Ferda couldn't care less what they thought of him. Sometime later, a royal carriage rolled fast down a dirt road under a burning orange sunset sky. Inside, Ferda hunched over, gripping his head. A brutal headache tore through him, and he groaned in pain. His head spun violently while nausea kept building. He realized his mana reserves were nearly empty after firing that mana shot with such extreme precision. Every jolt from the uneven road made it worse. Privately, he found himself missing the far smoother magical vehicles from his future life. Watching his condition, Ruri commented flatly, dripping with sarcasm. In her words, Ferda had really made quite the impression, killing the Grand Duchess's most loyal noble at their very first meeting. Ferda immediately asked if she meant Thessalos. Ruri nodded and explained that underneath his attitude, the man had genuinely been loyal to Valdrova. That answer left Ferda momentarily quiet. He asked again, just to confirm whether Thessalos had actually been an honest ruler. Ruri said he was about half clean, half corrupt. Still, compared to the other nobles in the region, he'd actually been one of the better ones. Hearing that, Ferda still felt confident his engagement wouldn't be threatened. He believed his reason for killing Thessalos was fully justified. Leaning back in his seat, he closed his eyes and traced back through his memories of the man's future. His gaze then shifted toward the sack containing Thessalos' head. Piece by piece, his memories from his past life fell back into place. Ferda finally remembered. Right around this exact time, Thessalos was supposed to be committing a major crime in his own territory. Not long after, they arrived at the late noble's castle. The head servant greeted the Grand Duchess's envoys respectfully and explained that his master wasn't currently at the castle. Flatly, Ferda replied that their master wasn't coming back, because he was dead. Without a word, Ruri tossed the heavy sack straight into the stunned servant's arms. Casually, she ordered him to hang its contents at the castle's main gate, right where everyone passing through would see it. The head servant untied the sack, then panic hit him instantly. The head inside really was the late Thessalos's. Ferda and Ruri ignored his shock completely and walked straight into Thessalos's lavish room to search for secret evidence. Ruri reminded him they needed to find proof of corruption, but Ferda pointed out that she'd literally just helped carry the man's severed head. Ruri threatened to take it back and call off the engagement, but that's when Ferda spotted a hidden passage beneath the bed. Ferda ran his hand along the wooden floor, searching for some hidden mechanism to open the entrance. It was taking too long, so Ruri told him to step aside. Casually, she clenched her fist and slammed it into the floor with full force, shattering the wood into pieces and tearing open a massive hole. She brushed off the dust and told him the way in was clear now. The two of them descended a dark stone staircase leading underground. Just a few steps in, they had to cover their noses. The stench of blood and rotting flesh was overwhelming. At the bottom sat a hidden laboratory packed with surgical equipment and piles of mutilated bodies, both human and monster. This was Thessalos's private experiment site, a follower of the Demon King who'd been practicing necromancy through forbidden magic. Ferda's eyes landed on a chained soldier. He realized immediately Thessalos had been grafting monster organs onto human bodies. Ruri's fury erupted. In her view, someone that cruel deserved exactly what he got. Still muttering about how humans could never be trusted, she admitted this time, executing Thessalos had been completely justified. But she stayed suspicious and asked how Ferda had known a place this secret even existed. Ferda didn't answer. He kept digging through the stacks of documents until he found exactly what he was looking for. The files contained Thessalos's secret work, a method for cultivating limitless mana. His notes explained that monsters generated mana endlessly inside their own bodies. That energy was normally impure and unusable, but if that biological trait could be artificially replicated, it would produce pure mana without limit, surpassing every restriction a magic circle imposed. Thessalos had even written down his ambition to build an undead army, revenge against the nobles who'd once exiled him to dragon territory. He believed this research would make him an archmage. In his last life, Ferda had faced this man directly. Back then, he'd wanted to use this exact technique for his own revenge. Now that same method sat in his hands again. He knew studying it would push him to the 8th circle far faster than any other path. But this time, he hesitated. Ruri mocked him. Humans were always starving for power, weren't they? No one would ever know, she said, if he just kept the documents for himself. She even congratulated him. He'd just stumbled onto the exact shortcut to power every human secretly craved. Against expectation, Ferda handed the entire manuscript straight to her. Firmly, he told her to destroy every piece of research in that lab. Ruri froze, stunned. She couldn't wrap her head around a mage willingly throwing away knowledge that powerful. Ferda admitted the research could reshape the entire world of magic, but he questioned what good that power was, if it only led to disaster in the end. He chose to burn the technique down to its roots, rather than risk falling for the same temptation again. A temptation that would one day cause Valdrova nothing but suffering. Ferda looked her straight in the eye and asked her to burn every last forbidden document. After a moment of silence, Ruri nodded firmly. Blue dragon fire erupted from her palm, consuming every file, every research note, and every experimental corpse until nothing remained but ash. Ferda understood something in that moment. Every spell carried the nature of the person who cast it. Thessalos's mana had been poisoned by deep-rooted hatred. The inferiority complex and thirst for revenge that had consumed the man's heart, that was a feeling Ferda knew all too well. It had once controlled him too. If he'd taken on that forbidden magic, Ferda knew exactly what would happen. He'd get swallowed by the same uncontrollable emotions all over again. That was exactly why the power had to be destroyed for good. He thought back to who he'd been in his last life, someone who could only survive by keeping hatred alive in his chest. That bitter memory, strangely, left his face looking far more at peace now. He watched the ash drift through the air, then commented with satisfaction that everything had burned completely. Ruri studied him for a long moment. In her eyes, Ferda was still impossible to read, borderline insane, even. But without quite realizing it, her opinion of him had already started shifting, little by little. After a long breath, Ruri told him it was time to leave the damp, dark basement and head back to the castle. She reminded him that showing up to the engagement ceremony with Valdrova, reeking of blood, would be incredibly disrespectful. Hearing that, Ferda's face lit up with excitement, as if he could barely wait for the engagement day to arrive. The day of the engagement ceremony finally arrived. Inside Archduke Valdrova's castle, Ruri and Ferda walked toward the ceremony site. Ruri asked if Ferda had finished writing his vows for the engagement. In an elegant formal suit, Ferda held up the paper with his written vows and confirmed everything was ready. Ferda admitted he actually found the ceremony pretty romantic. To him, it was rare and interesting, an archduke holding a ceremony where both partners had to write their own vows for each other. Ruri just sighed. Calling that place a ceremony venue was already too generous, in her opinion. Someone as powerful as Valdrova, holding an engagement in a spot worse than a horse stable. She found the whole thing genuinely embarrassing on her mistress's behalf. Ferda noticed how restless Ruri looked and studied her for a moment. He realized she was carrying a lot of quiet worry. She clearly wasn't thrilled about this engagement, but she still wanted Valdrova to be happy. Watching her get pulled between those two conflicting feelings left him with a small pang of sympathy for her. Ruri caught him staring and immediately crossed her arms, snapping at him. She warned him not to wrinkle the formal outfit she'd worked so hard to sew. Ferda stayed quiet and let her vent. Once things calmed down a bit, Ferda remembered how quiet everything had felt since the last summons. He asked about Valdrova's current situation, specifically the lords responsible for managing the territory. In his assessment, those lords didn't look capable of handling the front lines at all. Ruri confirmed his read. She explained that things had started out fine, back when the lords were given freedom to run their own regions. But with no oversight, they'd gotten busy lining their own pockets instead. They crushed public complaints using military force. If it kept going unchecked, a major rebellion could break out any time. Ferda took the situation seriously. He figured it should be an easy fix if Valdrova just stepped in directly. One order from her, and those lords would probably be on their knees begging for forgiveness. At the door to Valdrova's isolation chamber, Ruri hesitated, then said Ferda would understand for himself soon enough why Valdrova chose not to intervene. That vague answer only left him more confused. They stepped inside. Ruri lit a series of candles, filling the room with light. In the center sat the ceremonial drink both partners had to consume to seal their engagement. Ruri told Ferda to wait outside. She then cracked open the inner gate and stepped through. Instantly, Ferda felt a crushing weight of pressure. Just the air escaping through that narrow gap felt like it could crush his entire body. From behind the door, Valdrova slowly revealed her dragon form. Only a single claw emerged past the threshold, but the terrifying aura radiating from it alone was enough to make Ferda question whether he truly belonged, standing in front of something that massive. Ruri stood in the center of the room and began leading the ritual. She explained that on this day, mortal life and eternity would become one, forming a golden thread that neither heaven's authority nor the passage of time could ever sever. The mortal side, she continued, had to leave behind ignorance and wash away every trace of fear. After delivering the first part of the ritual, Ruri poured the drink into a bowl. Ferda drank it. His body felt different instantly. This clearly wasn't ordinary alcohol. Under its effect, the crushing pressure from the dragon's aura slowly began to ease. Ruri poured the drink into the bowl again. She continued the ritual, explaining that the eternal side had to become one by erasing all futility from the endless flow. Valdrova reached out with a trembling claw to take the bowl. Then something unexpected happened. As her claw tried to lift the bowl, her grip gave out. The bowl fell, and the ritual drink spilled across the entire floor. Ruri went quiet for a moment before deciding to restart the ceremony from the beginning. A short while later, Ferda's head felt unbearably light. There had been so many attempts, he'd lost count. He started wondering how many more times he'd have to drink the engagement wine. This was his first time going through anything like this in his entire life. But this had gone too far. If it kept going, his body could genuinely be in danger. Meanwhile, Valdrova dropped the bowl again. That was the final straw for Ruri's patience. She told Ferda to wait for a moment, then walked into Valdrova's chamber to speak with her mistress privately. A moment later, Ruri's shouting echoed through the room, startling Ferda. She tore into Valdrova without holding back. She reminded her that Valdrova herself had thrown a fit and insisted on marrying a mortal human in the first place. As a loyal servant, Ruri felt she'd already put up with every inconvenience that decision had caused. And now Valdrova was hiding while her fiancé waited outside. In Ruri's view, that would only humiliate him. She demanded Valdrova come out and greet Ferda with pride. She even warned that if Valdrova spilled the wine one more time, she wouldn't forgive her. A short while later, Ruri stepped back out and found Ferda lying on the floor, still recovering from the force of the roar. Calmly, she asked if he'd heard all that. Ferda nodded weakly. He admitted her roar had felt almost as strong as an actual dragon breath. Ruri laughed, a little awkward, and explained there hadn't been any way around it if they wanted the ceremony to actually go smoothly. Valdrova, she said, was genuinely afraid of interacting with humans. Ferda was caught off guard by that. Ruri explained further, Lady Valdrova truly avoided human contact. That was exactly why she rarely left her lair, except to hunt monsters. Ferda found it hard to believe someone's as powerful as Valdrova having a weakness like that. Still, he immediately asked when the ceremony would continue. Right then, the door to Valdrova's chamber opened slightly. For the first time, Valdrova stepped out in her human form and walked toward the ceremony table. But something caught Ferda's attention instantly. She was wearing full battle armor to her own engagement. Once she sat across from him, Ferda felt a flicker of disappointment. Her face was still hidden. He'd heard that a dragon's human form carried extraordinary beauty. Instead, Valdrova looked like someone ready to march onto a battlefield. Ruri picked the ceremony back up. She explained again that the mortal side had to become one by leaving behind ignorance and washing away all fear, while the eternal side had to become one by erasing futility from the endless flow. Once she finished pouring the ritual wine, Ferda's attention shifted to Valdrova, who slowly raised her hand toward her helmet. Valdrova lifted part of the helmet away. Her soft lips came into view, along with strands of delicate hair falling loose. Even with only half her face visible, Ferda froze completely. Her beauty left him utterly speechless. Valdrova then lifted the bowl gracefully and drank the wine inside. Once she finished, she let out a small sound that left Ferda even more transfixed. He felt completely captivated. He even found himself wondering if he'd had too much of the engagement wine and it was messing with his head, because the deep fear he'd felt just from looking at her earlier had completely vanished. He also felt a quiet admiration that Valdrova was willing to go through all of this for an ordinary human like him. Ruri moved the ceremony to its next stage, the reading of each partner's written vows. Ferda pulled his vow paper from inside his jacket. For a second, he thought the words he'd written back then no longer meant anything, now that he'd returned to the past. Still, he decided to read them anyway. He looked directly at his future wife and began speaking the vow aloud. Ferda said Valdrova might not know him well yet, but he already knew her far more deeply than she realized. Valdrova had once given him her heart, and through that heart, he'd finally come to understand who she truly was. He remembered how she'd been betrayed again and again, blamed for crimes she never committed. Even so, she'd carried out her duties with unshaken dignity. She'd even embraced people who hated her for no reason at all. To Ferda, her steadfast refusal to let go of what she wanted to protect was what had pulled him back onto the right path. Because of that, he swore that just as she'd once given her heart to him, this time, he would give his heart to her. To Ferda, Valdrova was his ruler, and everything he had. After finishing his vow, Ferda said there was one more thing he wanted to say, something that wasn't written down. He told her how honored he felt to be engaged to someone as beautiful as she was. That unexpected line caught Valdrova off guard. Ruri asked Valdrova to read the vow she'd written, but Valdrova didn't answer. Instead, she stood up abruptly. Without saying a single word, she turned around, walked back into her chamber, and shut the door. Ferda and Ruri could only exchange a confused look. Strangely, Ruri looked genuinely pleased. She quickly told Ferda to head out, declaring the engagement ceremony officially complete. Ferda stayed silent. Ruri called his name again to make sure he'd heard her. After a pause, Ferda made an unexpected request instead. He asked if he'd be allowed to isolate himself for about 3 days. That request caught Ruri off guard. She immediately assumed Ferda was heartbroken after watching Valdrova walk away without ever reading her own vow. Ruri walked into Valdrova's chamber, praising her mistress's move. In her view, Valdrova had just shown exactly what a dragon was capable of, landing a decisive blow against that arrogant man. She also realized something else. Every part of it had been planned from the start. The retreat after the strike tactic had thrown Ferda off completely, something Ruri herself hadn't even seen coming. That meant Valdrova still held full control of the situation. But Valdrova stayed silent. Documents were scattered across the entire room, as if they'd been thrown in every direction. Confused, Ruri asked if all this chaos was really part of her plan. Hadn't she been looking forward to this engagement ceremony? A moment later, Valdrova's true form came into view. In her dragon shape, she covered her face with both hands, overwhelmed with embarrassment. The wrecked room, it turned out, was the result of her own panic. Valdrova admitted she'd wanted to read her wedding vow from the start, as the one welcoming her life partner. But when Ruri pressed her for the reason, she admitted she simply hadn't had the courage. She couldn't bring herself to look Ferda in the eye and say those words out loud. His gaze felt so sharp, yet his voice came out so gentle. Every time she looked at him, her mind went blank and her courage disappeared with it. Watching Valdrova act like this left Ruri momentarily speechless. After a breath, she reminded her that even though today was a happy day, someone needed to prepare for disappointment too. She explained that Ferda was now officially Valdrova's fiancé and would soon be managing the Eastern Territory in her name. But people could change once they gained power. Ruri reminded her the same thing had happened with the third prince before. Valdrova stayed quiet, listening. Ruri lowered her head and apologized for bringing up a decades-old memory again. Still, she said, that was the best advice she had to give. Valdrova understood Ruri's concern. She knew mortal humans eventually aged and disappeared. Because of that, she thought it might be better to bury this growing feeling inside her before it turned into a source of pain. Meanwhile, Ferda sat alone in his room after the engagement ceremony ended. Up to that point, everything still felt like a dream. He'd actually gotten engaged to Valdrova. In his last life, hatred and rage had consumed him completely. Because of that, he'd never felt anything close to what he was feeling now. But this time, everything was different. Ever since meeting Valdrova, moment after moment, with her kept replaying in his mind, his red circle had even started acting unstable. Ferda still didn't fully understand what emotion was triggering it. He knew an uncontrolled circle could eventually destroy its own user. But if he managed to master it, this same instability could become a chance to grow stronger. In his last life, he'd already reached the peak of power once. Getting back there wasn't impossible. A circle needed two core things, mana and mental strength. As a first circle mage, Ferda's mana capacity was still extremely limited, but his mental strength had once reached archmage level. With that advantage, he controlled every raging surge of mana without wasting a drop of energy. He kept compressing the mana layer by layer, until he finally formed a second circle. In just 3 days, Ferda reached the second circle, one step closer to Valdrova. Not long after, Ferda ended his self-isolation. Ruri froze the instant she sensed the shift in his power. She hadn't expected him to reach the second circle in only 3 days. His door had stayed locked the entire time. She found herself wondering if red circle mages could really progress that fast. Ferda just explained that every mage grew at a different pace. But deep down, Ferda understood the hidden nature of the red circle. Every new circle required a stronger emotional trigger to form, and whatever emotion sat strongest at the core of that circle would slowly become part of the user's own personality. His red circle had first awakened through overwhelming hatred. That was exactly why, even after his revenge was complete, he kept finding something new to hate. As they walked, Ruri led Ferda toward the royal office. From that point on, he'd be handling government affairs in Valdrova's name. Even as just a representative for the Grand Duke, the room had been fully prepared for him. The moment he stepped inside, Ferda noticed every detail had been arranged with care. Even inside a dragon's stronghold, everything showed just how much attention Valdrova had paid to her fiancé. Ferda sat down and officially began his first task as acting ruler. He quickly realized the territory had been neglected. For a long time, Valdrova's attention pulled elsewhere by her own responsibilities. But now, with Thessalos's head on display and his crimes exposed, the surrounding lords had grown far more cautious around him. With Ruri's help, handling government affairs became much easier. Ferda's first decision was sending letters to every lord he'd previously met. Ruri explained that these letters would serve as Ferda's first official greeting as the Grand Duke's representative. Once he officially took the position, Ferda immediately informed the nobles that he would now handle all internal affairs of the territory as the Grand Duke's regent. Anyone who opposed his decisions was free to remain silent. Ferda would simply take their silence as a sign of mutual respect. With the nobles' affairs settled, Ferda turned his attention to another major problem, the monsters. There were so many monsters scattered across the territory that they were destroying farmland and taking the lives of its people. Grand Duke Valdrova could suppress even disaster-class monsters, but his territory was simply too vast for him to eliminate every small monster roaming around. That was why Ferda decided his first priority would be recruiting talented people. Ruri asked if Ferda already had any candidates in mind. Ferda handed her a list containing several names. Ruri frowned as she looked through it. She complained that Ferda seemed to expect them to find all these candidates themselves. One name was even more unusual. It belonged to a scholar Ruri had never heard of. The two of them then headed to the city of scholars, Escalaria, to find their first candidate. Ferda explained that it was normal for Ruri not to know the scholar. His talent had never been discovered by the world. Ruri narrowed her eyes. She suspected that Ferda had only written the information down on the spot. Ferda calmly assured her that gathering information like this had taken a very long time. But deep inside, Ferda still remembered the truth. This list had once been his personal list of targets. In his previous life, Ferda had investigated their achievements one by one while searching for reasons to hate them. He studied every weakness and mistake they had made, then waited for the right opportunity to use them against his targets. His hatred had consumed him so completely that Ferda kept looking for new people to blame for everything that happened to him. Now, looking back on that past, Ferda realized that all those obsessive thoughts had only been paranoia born from his own anger. Still, finding a scholar who was unknown to everyone in a city as large as Escalaria would not be easy. While thinking about their next move, Ferda and Ruri sat near a statue in the middle of the market. A fruit vendor nearby noticed them and called out cheerfully. He offered them some sweet snacks, proudly mentioning that academy students loved his products too. That caught Ferda's attention. He immediately walked over and asked if many academy graduates usually came by his stall. The vendor proudly explained that he had been running the stall for a long time. Over the years, he had watched countless graduates pass by. Ferda then asked about a scholar, known by the nickname Messi. Ruri immediately frowned at the strange nickname. She even wondered why Ferda wanted to bring someone who sounded so messy to their castle. The vendor recognized the nickname, but he slyly raised a honey-coated fruit skewer and complained that after years of running his stall, it was getting harder to remember everyone's faces. It was obvious what he wanted. He expected Ferda to buy something in exchange for the information. Ferda finally asked how much it would cost. The vendor excitedly replied that 5 copper coins would get them 3 fruit skewers. Ferda pulled out his wallet and decided to buy only one. Before he could pay, Ruri ordered him to buy all 3. Ferda stared at her in surprise. The vendor happily handed the 3 honey-coated fruit skewers to Ruri. The moment she saw the sweet snacks, Ruri's eyes lit up. Ferda admitted that he never expected Ruri to like food like this. Ruri insisted that the purchase was nothing more than a bribe. She claimed it was necessary to make sure the information they received was completely accurate. But as Ruri enjoyed the sweet fruit, her expression became incredibly innocent and childlike. Ferda froze when he saw it. He had always believed that Ruri, just like him, had buried her emotions long ago, but Ruri could still show an expression that free and genuinely cute. Ferda kept staring at her. Ruri misunderstood his gaze and thought he wanted one of her fruit skewers. She quickly pulled all 3 away from him. Then, after an awkward pause, she offered him one. Ferda gently refused and told Ruri to finish her food. The sky was already getting dark, so the two of them decided to head back. The next day, during the Academy's graduation ceremony, Bernal Marquis, the scholar known by the nickname Messi, was suddenly approached by a group of men. Bernal immediately became frightened and asked how they had managed to find him there. The leader casually put an arm around Bernal's shoulder and joked that since they were already this close, of course he had come to congratulate him on graduating. He also mocked Bernal's nickname and wondered what the man had done to earn such a strange name. After congratulating him again, his tone suddenly changed. He reminded Bernal that it was time to pay his debt. The men surrounding Bernal began cracking their knuckles. Cold sweat covered Bernal's body. All he could do was let out a nervous laugh. It turned out that Bernal owed them a considerable amount of money. The group then dragged Bernal back to his room. Without hesitation, they began smashing various belongings inside while demanding that Bernal tell them exactly when he planned to repay the entire debt. Bernal was cornered, so he begged them for a little more time. That only made the leader angrier. He had waited for years for Bernal to graduate, yet Bernal still had the nerve to ask for an extension. The man was about to continue when he suddenly covered his nose after noticing the disgusting corpse sitting on Bernal's desk. He asked what the hell Bernal was researching. Bernal answered with surprising excitement. The creature was a monster. His research focused on turning monster corpses into mana stones and other sources of energy. Getting enough material for the research was difficult, but if he succeeded, his discovery could become a major breakthrough for the entire continent. The man only scoffed. He didn't care about Burnell's research. All he wanted to know was whether it could make money right now. Burnell admitted that there were still too many variables. His research wouldn't be profitable anytime soon. The man told Burnell to abandon the research and offered him another way to pay off his debt. He pulled out a folding knife and suggested that Burnell start making weapons instead. Weapon research could make a lot of money. With Burnell's brilliant mind, he should be able to create something profitable. After all, wasn't he once the best freshman in his class? Burnell nervously refused. He still had other research that might eventually make money. The man immediately threw the knife. It flew past Burnell and nearly hit a vital spot. His voice turned cold as he warned Burnell not to test his patience any further. Burnell was in no position to make demands, but even though he was terrified, Burnell still refused to develop weapons. He begged for another chance to work on his other research. The man ignored him. He slammed Burnell's head into the floor, and the others immediately joined in. They were furious that Burnell had the nerve to refuse after borrowing so much money from them. The leader even told Burnell that he might as well die. They couldn't afford to lose even a single coin. Burnell covered his head and begged them not to hit him there. He was already in such a miserable state that he started wondering if his life would end that day. Then a sharp voice suddenly ordered them to stop. Burnell raised his head. Ferda had entered the room with Ruri. Ferda explained that the commotion could be heard from outside. It also happened that he had business with Burnell. The men stopped beating him. Their leader assumed Ferda was nothing more than a wealthy young noble from another territory. He even asked if Burnell owed Ferda money too. Ferda simply replied that this had nothing to do with the man's question. The leader then told Ferda to wait. He still needed to beat Burnell enough to make sure the man could talk. Ferda pointed out that this was exactly the problem. He didn't need Burnell's mouth. He needed Burnell's brain. So Ferda offered to pay off Burnell's entire debt. The leader became interested and asked if the interest would be included too. Burnell's total debt came to 72 gold coins. The amount was so large that the men doubted Ferda could actually afford it. Ruri answered for him. She dropped a sack filled with gold coins onto the table. The entire room went silent. The leader even called Burnell a lucky bastard for having someone as wealthy as Ferda backing him. He reached for the money and declared the debt settled, but Ruri immediately grabbed his wrist. Ferda explained that their deal wasn't finished yet. From the beginning, Ferda had said that he wanted to buy Burnell's brain, but after seeing how badly Burnell had been beaten, Ferda wasn't sure if his brain could still function properly. If they damaged something Ferda was about to buy, shouldn't they have to pay compensation? The leader was confused. He couldn't understand why Ferda was talking about Burnell like he was some kind of merchandise. When he questioned Ferda's logic, Ruri tightened her grip. The man winced in pain. He couldn't believe a little girl could have that much strength. That comment offended Ruri. Her grip became even tighter. The man screamed as the bones in his hand felt like they were about to break. Ruri finally let go and casually brushed her hand clean. Ferda then said he would be counting on Ruri. Ruri released dragon fear. An overwhelming pressure filled the room in an instant. Every man there dropped to his knees. Their bodies froze, leaving them completely unable to move. The leader had no idea what was happening. This pressure was clearly nothing like any magic he knew. He didn't even realize that Ruri was actually a dragon. Ferda stepped in front of him and gave him two choices. They could pay compensation for beating Burnell, or they could receive the exact same beating they had given him. Ferda added that debt collectors like them obviously couldn't afford to lose even a single coin, so the second option should be the easiest choice. With that, Ferda decided that every one of them would receive punishment equal to what they had done. This time, their own bodies would become the payment for their debt. Ruri clenched both fists and prepared to teach them a lesson. The men's screams soon echoed throughout the entire building as Ruri started beating them without mercy. Once she was sure they had learned their lesson, Ruri calmly cleaned her hands. The men staggered around before trying to escape the place. It seemed they had come there just to get beaten. After everything was over, Burnell repeatedly thanked Ferda and Ruri for saving him. He had no idea how he could ever repay their kindness. Burnell then introduced himself as Burnell Marquis, the scholar known as the Messy Scholar. He adjusted his broken glasses and asked for Ferda's name. Ferda introduced himself as Ferda Valdrova. The moment Burnell heard the name, he was shocked. He quickly bowed and apologized for failing to realize that Ferda was the Grand Duke's husband. Ferda didn't take offense. He understood that Burnell had no reason to recognize him. Ferda had come because he already knew about Burnell's research. Burnell was stunned to hear that Ferda was genuinely interested in his work. Ferda explained that he had heard about Burnell's research into using monster corpses. The Far East had an endless supply of monsters. So Ferda offered Burnell a place at Castle Valdrova, where he could continue his research without restrictions. Ferda even promised to provide all the materials, funding, and facilities Burnell needed to develop his research. Burnell's face immediately lit up. For the first time, it felt like his dream might finally become reality. Ruri couldn't help questioning whether this scholar was actually sane after seeing how excited he was. But then Ferda revealed what he wanted in return. Burnell would have to use the results of his research to create weapons. Burnell's excitement vanished instantly. The offer was almost exactly the same as what the loan sharks had demanded from him earlier. Burnell nervously refused. To him, weapons would only take human lives and destroy peace. Burnell wanted the territory to remain a peaceful place. Ferda understood how deeply Burnell valued peace. But Ferda reminded him about the monsters that had become the focus of his research. He asked Burnell how many people a single monster could kill in the Far East. Burnell fell silent. He had no answer. Ferda then revealed the reality hidden behind that peaceful life. Every 3 days, Grand Duke Valdrova herself had to head toward the front lines where the giant monsters gathered. Some of those monsters were powerful enough to wipe out a city like Escolaria in an instant. Every time Valdrova went to the front lines, she risked her life to protect the territory. Meanwhile, people who knew nothing about this reality simply enjoyed the peace created by her sacrifice. They lived as if nothing had ever happened. That was why Ferda needed someone who could create weapons capable of helping them bring down those monsters. It would also reduce some of the burden Valdrova had been carrying all this time. And for that task, Ferda chose Burnell, the scholar everyone had mocked for years, as their chief researcher. Burnell's eyes immediately focused on the appointment letter in Ferda's hand. The offer brought his excitement back, even though he was still unsure about creating weapons with his own hands. Ferda already knew what Burnell's future held. Burnell Marquis, the messy scholar, would eventually become the scholar who opened the way to the era of magical engineering. In the future Ferda had once lived through, Burnell would even become a man willing to start a war in order to protect peace. And now, Ferda intended to change that path from the very beginning. After leaving Burnell's residence, Ferda and Ruri headed back to the castle by carriage. During the trip, Ferda realized they still didn't have a definite answer from Burnell about his offer. Burnell needed time to think about it, so Ferda wasn't worried at all. He was confident Burnell would come to them once he made his decision. Ruri, meanwhile, seemed to be getting more and more fond of sweet snacks. She was still enjoying her honey-coated fruit skewer, while explaining that she was only filling her stomach, especially since they still had a long journey ahead. Their next target was someone from the red-eyed race. Their eyes could cancel magic circles, which had made them natural enemies of mages for generations. That ability also led to widespread persecution. Eventually, the entire race was believed to have gone extinct. Ruri was shocked to learn that someone still carried their bloodline. If they could find that person, they would have an extremely valuable asset on their side. But Ruri also pointed out that finding someone who had spent years hiding from the world wouldn't be easy. Ferda then asked if they still had enough money to continue the search. Ruri assured him that they had enough money to fill an entire carriage. That was more than enough for their next trip to Halim. The moment Ruri heard the name, her body froze. Her face turned pale. She panicked after realizing they were heading to Halim, a city famous for corruption and nightlife. Ferda calmly confirmed that Halim was indeed their destination. The person they were looking for was a gambler. Not long after, Ferda and Ruri arrived at a casino in Halim. At the bottom of the stairs, many people dressed in elegant evening clothes sat around green felt gambling tables. The focus then shifted to one of the gambling tables. A well-dressed man sat with several women who were excitedly following the card game. Hands moved across the green table toward the huge piles of gold poker chips scattered in front of them. Right then, Ruri and Ferda arrived with a large chest filled with gold poker chips. The sheer amount of money shocked everyone nearby. Whispers quickly spread through the casino. Some people wondered if Ferda was betting his entire fortune, while others could only stare at the massive pile of gold. There was almost enough money in that chest to match the budget of an entire territory. Ferda and Ruri carried the chest over to the wealthy man who had become the center of attention. The man looked confused by their arrival. Ruri quietly told Ferda that the man's eyes weren't red. Ferda was still certain that this was the person they were looking for. The man let out a small laugh. He realized that Ferda and Ruri had come looking for Zed Swallow. He casually invited them to join the poker game. According to Zed, new players were always welcome. This reckless man was their next recruitment target. His name was Zed. Ferda sat down and played against him. Ferda eventually won the game. Zed happily announced Ferda's victory. His lover then asked why he hadn't taken the game seriously. Zed simply laughed and said that luck didn't always favor him. He even joked that having a beautiful woman beside him might bring him some extra luck. But Ferda quickly realized that Zed wasn't actually interested in gambling. His attention was focused on winning over the noblewoman beside him. Ferda also noticed that Zed had an incredible way with words, an attractive appearance that appealed to nobles, and impressive sleight of hand skills. Zed was like a young man who shone in a world built entirely around money. But Ferda also understood his weakness. The moment Zed sensed danger, he would run away like a crafty rabbit. That was why Ferda decided to close off every possible escape route. The two played another round of cards. Zed teased Ferda, saying that the young master was finally starting to understand the game. Ferda admitted that he was enjoying the game because of Zed. Zed then hoped they could play together again someday. Ferda calmly told him there wouldn't be another chance. He explained that it would be troublesome if Ruri, who was standing behind him, started thinking Ferda was a gambler. Zed chuckled and said everyone always used the same excuse. He understood that Ferda wanted to look good in front of a woman, but he was still curious about why Ferda had come to this place. Ferda let out a long sigh before finally revealing his true purpose. He was looking for Amelia. The atmosphere around the table immediately changed. Everyone was shocked to hear that name. Zed instantly understood why Ferda had really come. Anger began building inside him, but he kept a faint smile on his face. Before Zed could ask anything else, Ferda suddenly announced that he was going all in. His entire fortune was placed into the pot. The announcement sent the entire casino into an uproar. Excited whispers spread as everyone realized that Ferda was truly betting his entire fortune against Zed. Ferda had finally decided to take a huge risk. Zed kept his smile, but he knew he had to win this round. He accepted Ferda's bet and called. Zed then revealed his cards. He had a royal flush. Ruri fell silent in shock when she saw the result, while Ferda simply smiled. Even though Ferda had tried to bluff with his hidden bet, Zed had completely won the round. Zed's expression turned serious after his victory. His red eyes were finally revealed. He told Ferda and Ruri to follow him because they had a lot to discuss. The three of them moved to a restaurant. Zed poured a drink into his glass with anger written across his face. He demanded to know how Ferda had learned about Amelia and whether they were connected to the men who had been searching for him earlier. His anger grew even stronger when Zed demanded to know where his younger sister's was. Ferda immediately realized that the brown eyes Zed had shown earlier were nothing more than a disguise. Ferda explained that he had no connection to the men Zed was talking about. He then described Zed as a plaything for noblewomen and a gambler who spent almost all his time in casinos. But Ferda knew that this was nothing more than a fake identity. Zed's sleight of hand was so incredible that he could bankrupt an entire casino if he used his skills seriously. Ferda also pointed out that Zed deliberately made himself look cheap by entertaining nobles with cheap wine. There had to be a reason behind all of it. Sweat began running down Zed's face. Ferda looked directly at him and revealed the truth Zed had been hiding. Zed was building connections among the nobles in order to find his younger sister Amelia. As the Swallow siblings, Zed and Amelia had likely suffered greatly simply because they were born into the red-eyed race. The red-eyed race had been caught between mages who wanted to wipe them out and factions that wanted to exploit their abilities. Their very existence had become a major threat. Zed had lost his younger sister in the middle of that conflict. He hid his identity and approached the nobles, hoping to find someone who could help him. But the nobles only cared about status and appearance. To them, Zed was nothing more than entertainment. Ferda then pointed out the truth. No matter how much money Zed managed to collect, he would never get anything useful from those nobles. Zed held his forehead, frustrated and unsure of what to do next. He still had not found his sister, and now Ferda also knew his true identity. But Ferda had another option. He introduced himself as Ferda, Valdrova's future husband, and offered Zed a position as his servant. The mention of Valdrova immediately caught Zed off guard. He looked at Ferda suspiciously and wondered if Ferda was really serious about hiring him. The offer was even harder to believe because Ferda was willing to accept a man from the red-eyed race as his subordinate. Ferda simply nodded and confirmed that he was serious. Ruri then handed Ferda the employment contract. Ferda told Zed to read it himself if he still doubted his words. By accepting the offer, Zed would gain access to the noble circles while continuing his search for his sister. Zed became uneasy as he considered the offer. A chance like this did not come every day. Still, he was not sure whether Ferda could really be trusted. Zed admitted that the offer was tempting, but he had two conditions. First, he wanted a proper salary for his work. He still needed money after all. Second, if Ferda ever showed hidden intentions toward his abilities, Zed would leave immediately. After stating his conditions, Zed started to wonder if Ferda would really let him walk away after learning his true identity. He almost added a third condition, but changed his mind. Zed decided to accept the offer as long as Ferda agreed to the first two conditions. Ferda went silent for a moment before accepting them, but Ferda had one condition of his own. Their contract would only remain valid until Zed found his sister. After that, Zed would be free to decide whether he wanted to stay or leave. Zed immediately stood up and slammed his palm onto the table. He could not believe Ferda was actually willing to let him go instead of turning him into a slave or selling him to someone else. Ferda calmly explained that he had no interest in buying or selling people. Once the contract ended, Zed would be completely free to choose his own path. Zed was even more shocked. He pointed out that Ferda was a mage. How could Ferda not be afraid of letting a member of the red-eyed race walk around freely? The red-eyed race was known as the natural enemy of mages, after all. Ferda treated the concern like a joke. In his view, any mage who feared the red-eyed race simply because their magic could not affect them was a failed mage. Ferda also made it clear that he would never force Zed to stay. Even if Ferda tried to restrain him, capturing Zed would not be easy. In the future, Zed would become a master thief capable of escaping from the most notorious prisons multiple times. Zed raised his beer and called Ferda a truly strange noble. Ferda calmly admitted that he was. Zed took another sip and gave a faint smile. In the end, he decided to give the position a try. He then asked about his first mission as Ferda's servant. Ferda did not hesitate. He told Zed to seduce a woman and bring her back to their place. Zed was so shocked by his first assignment that he sprayed his beer across the table. Ferda calmly explained that a task like this should be easy for someone with Zed's abilities. All Zed had to do was bring back a woman who lived alone. And with that strange first mission decided, the scene shifted to a dark and silent forest beneath a purple night sky. Several crows flew between the trees, while a small wooden house stood isolated deep inside the forest.